Welcome back to Regulated. This is Tony Glover back again, and I'm here with Christian Bax. How are you doing, Bax?
I'm doing great, my man. How's life? How's life treating you? It's been about a month since we recorded.
Yeah, we're in the post-session summer vacation, so to speak. I know a lot of people listening to this podcast have been jetting around the country and around the state doing political fundraisers, so it's a fun time. But with the 24/7 law practice, it's been busy this summer as well.
So just give you a little peek behind the curtain. There's a lot of stuff that Tony and I have kind of gone back and forth with over the past month about stuff we want to talk about. And I'm really excited to get into a little stuff that's going on the West Coast today.
Yeah, one of the things Christian and I talked about was, how do we talk about new frontiers of regulated industries, regulated substances? And there was an article that caught both of our eyes that kind of touched on this more from the investor standpoint than the regulatory standpoint. But I thought it was fascinating. This was from CNBC.com back in late May. The author's Christina Farr. She's a good follow on Twitter, etc. Investors are starting to bet big on psychedelic medicine. And the key points here are that psychedelic substances were once viewed as drugs of abuse, still are in many corners of society. But now regulators and investors are coming around to their potential therapeutic uses. Federal regulators just approved a variant of ketamine, editor's note, that's also known as Special K. I believe it's a horse tranquilizer, at least that's what we were taught in DARE classes in the 1990s. Federal regulators just approved a variant of ketamine to treat depression after years of clinical studies. And now a group of European investors have come together to fund new targets to treat mental health disorders, including R-ketamine, which is another variant of ketamine, and psychedelic mushrooms. So, of course, along with that, Christian and I have been seeing some regulatory developments involving mushrooms and psilocybin, and I thought this was a great opportunity for us to dig into this issue.
Psilocybin has been super interesting over the past 18 months to kind of follow what's going on. We're going to get into it a little bit later in the podcast, but Oakland and Denver have decriminalized psilocybin, and it's generally getting talked about as this substance that can potentially help with depression, some mental health issues, and the more this research is coming out, that a lot of these researchers are finding that there are relatively low risks for psilocybin itself, and this is kind of, pardon the pun, but kind of mushroomed into a much larger discussion about psychedelics in general. And to bring it full circle, I think that's kind of where we're seeing some of these financial journalists writing about this, because they're like this group of people who have so much money, who either derived from the cannabis industry or the original financiers who were pumping money into that industry and making a killing. They're all also looking at what's next, and a lot of them are you talk to them are kind of looking, two fingers to my eyes, two fingers to you, and watching what's happening with magic mushrooms as these psychedelics out on the West Coast.
Yeah, so should we start kind of at the top and talk a little bit about what is psilocybin and give a breakdown for folks that aren't familiar?
Right. Psilocybin is a hallucinogenic chemical that's obtained from certain types of fresh or dried mushrooms. And those mushrooms are, they slender stems, they're pretty delicate looking, they have dark kind of gills on the underside. And you generally consume these mushrooms by, eating them. By brewing them in a tea, or you can grind them up and put them in things that you're then going to consume. But generally, you orally consume the product, and when you do, it's generally well known that they can make you hallucinate. What's a little bit less known is that frequently they can cause nausea and vomiting. They can cause muscle weakness, lack of coordination. And when you look this up on like the DEA and you kind of read the warning label on psilocybin and aka magic mushrooms, one of the things that they frequently as a red flag is that large amounts can cause psychosis or death. And when you really dig into it, what it seems like that death risk is really from not so much the magic mushrooms, but novice users, people who don't know what they're doing, going out and looking for magic mushrooms and picking one of the many type of toxic mushrooms out there that don't just make you hallucinate, they make you die because they shut down your kidneys and liver. But now you're seeing this trend where some people are starting to use this hallucinogenic properties of these mushrooms to kind of tap into latent emotions, maybe suppressed emotions, kind of creating this kind of positive break within people who are really psychologically constricted or really going through something. We're going to talk about a study later, which are future cancer patients who are at their end of their life and are really stressed out about that fact, and these consumption of psilocybin seems to help with that.
Well, let's talk about recreational use, because the common view of a mushroom user is kind of the hippie wearing a poncho, maybe at a music festival. How rare or common is recreational use in the United States right now?
It's rare. From the research I did, the stat I found was that less than 0.1% of Americans report using psychedelics within the last year.
And that's all psychedelics, right?
Right. And I mean, that could be higher. But even if you're saying, it's like approaching 1 or 2% compared to, say, where cannabis was when it kind of hit its stride and cultural momentum towards legalization, that was, much, much, much higher than, the very low single digits. So it's much more on the fringe than say cannabis was back in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So America has a history of using psilocybin, and this is all research from Bax, but I'm going to steal some of it. I think this is fascinating. Magic mushrooms have been featured in prehistoric art in Europe and in Mesoamerica, and apparently Catholic missionaries during the Spanish conquest were kind of some of the first people to prohibit it and kind of stomp it out. Is that true?
Yeah, the Puritans, they get a lot of bad rap for not being fun up in like Virginia and Massachusetts, but it turns out the Catholics down in Latin America weren't much more fun. But I mean that's what it seems like, was that at least the research was that the Catholics, when they came over, post Columbian life in the Americas wasn't too favorable towards psychedelics, although you when something's culturally ingrained the way that psilocybin seemed to have been, that it was never stomped out. And so you have these indigenous cultures in the rainforest that this very much was preserved, and it's kind of come out into the mainstream. So you have countries like Brazil that have a much looser legal and regulatory prohibition against psilocybin, where you can go to these compounds where you get this alternative medicine where you can experience like ayahuasca or magic mushrooms, or you don't even want to know the rabbit hole I went down on, like frog licking and frog venom. I had no idea how many freaking internet sites there are devoted to like frog poison and its psychological effects on people, which is, I guess, something we're going to get into too. So Tony, I want to bring it back though, kind of ground it into what we're talking about today.
All right, well, let's talk about the pharmacology a little bit. Apparently, the typical duration of a trip is 4 to 8 hours, and the physical effects tend to appear around 20 minutes after ingestion. Again, Christian mentioned this before, but the effects may include nausea, vomiting, muscle weakness, drowsiness, and a lack of coordination. And of course, the main event being the hallucinogenic effects. Let's talk a little bit about what the Drug Enforcement Agency says about the physiological effects. First off, again, going to hallucinations, you've got the sensory effects, right, Christian?
Right. So, you have enhanced sensitivity to sound. You can see color shimmering or halos, or, just reading this, it sounds pretty stereotypical of what kind of the psychedelic experience. Although I've talked to some people who have actually consumed psilocybin before. I have never actually done it myself. And they described it as a very mellow experience rather than this kind of shimmering, kind of explosive, trippy hallucination feeling. And so kind of what I sensed was the potency for these mushrooms varies. The effect from person to person, it's kind of like cannabis, can also reportedly vary, where you have some people who get energy and some people it really locks them down and they can't move and they're kind of stuck in the couch. And so that's kind of what makes the psychological element of this so interesting, is that it can have these multifaceted impacts on people, and kind of figuring out what those triggers, what it's inhibiting, what it's releasing in your body and in your brain.
Sure, and this gets to the research aspect of it. I mean, this information we shared about the sensory effects is from the DEA, so it could be written a bit like, my grandmother wrote it. So yeah, definitely. I've also read that the effects can vary greatly from person to person, just like with other types of drugs. And of course, just like with certain types of strains of cannabis, the dosage can vary significantly from mushroom to mushroom, which is another variable here.
Right. And so, from my research, it was, typically it's between 0.5 and 2% of psilocybin of the dried weight of the mushroom. Obviously, so you have a fairly significant variance. But what was really interesting to me is I kept coming back to this toxicity thing. I'm looking at this constantly through a regulator's lens. The business stuff is interesting, but I think that comes down the road. The first step is you're looking at this as a regulator, and you're looking at, like, is this ultimately going to be safe? And so I think that's really where cannabis kind of got a lot of momentum over the last 2 decades. It was really hard to stamp out that argument that people have been using this for thousands of years and it's really not killing people, which I understand that's a very low bar, but that's kind of the threshold that when we're talking about drug legalization, or at least drug science, that like is the actual toxic levels of this, is it, can a person actually reach those toxicity levels, and like will it actually kill you once you do? And just repeatedly, the literature I saw was that it doesn't seem to have a high toxicity level, and that the biggest potential danger is from people who go out and pick their own mushrooms and pick the wrong types of mushrooms. And so, but when you do that, it's not a trivial matter. So some of the effects when you eat the wrong type of mushroom are terrifying. And Tony, I don't know, have you seen the show Chernobyl, the HBO series?
Yes.
That's fantastic. Okay. So reading about like these poisonous mushrooms, it reminded me of the firemen at Chernobyl, where they're spraying water on the reactor. One of them picks up part of the graphite core and it kind of melts his hand, but then everything's cool for like, they're in pain, they go to the hospital, and then everything's good for 24, 48 hours. And then their whole body basically melts off of their skeleton. And so these magic mushrooms, one in particular, so take, for example, Galerina marginata. I'm probably butcher that pronunciation, but it's a fairly common a monotoxin-bearing little brown mushroom. And when you eat that, there's a 50% fatality rate if you don't have access to medical care. So basically, we're talking like if you consume this in a third world country, you can't get to a hospital. You've got a coin flip's chance of dying from that. And so it seems very similar to the radiation poisoning, where you have no outward symptoms, but inside of your body, those toxins are destroying your kidneys and liver. And then you have these violent vomiting, you have blood coming out of parts of your body that it shouldn't be coming out of, and some severe cramps. And then you got 24, 48 hours where nothing happens, where you're cool. Actually, it's very common for people to get dismissed from hospitals or medical because they're like, oh, you're good. I guess you had some bad Taco Bell or something.
This is the most terrifying thing. Wait, so you go through violent vomiting, severe cramps, you're emitting blood. You have 2 days where you're fine. So in the first 24 hours, the hospital is going to monitor you. Your family's going to watch you. And then you start feeling better. At the end of the second day, you walk out of the hospital. Maybe you're going to go play racquetball. And then stage 4 kicks in, kidney and liver failure.
Right.
Basically,
right.
The moral of the story is, please don't go picking brown mushrooms. I guess really the moral of the story is this is what government enforced prohibition does to the citizenry, right?
Right.
Don't go picking unregulated mushrooms unless you're an expert.
Right. There's 2 thoughts I had on this. So the first thought I had was this: if this goes towards decriminalization and it goes towards a medical use, there's going to have to be licensed providers, right? So there will have to be a licensed regulated source, which means people who can capture those licenses are going to make a lot of money if it blows up. But there's no way you get you get like a home grow or like legalization of going out and picking psilocybin, because it's going to be real hard to make that public policy. The second thought I had was my dad, because my dad, like, he goes out and walks around, like, Tallahassee has a lot of parks. He loves going out and walking around the parks and like picking up wild mushrooms. And like there's this one like big white circular type of mushroom that they're really good, but he goes out and picks it, and he figured out like a couple years ago that there's actually like an identical looking mushroom that will literally freaking kill you. And the only way that you figure this out is you like pick it and then you put it on a piece of paper and you like look at the spores that come off of that. And I forget if it's the good one turns the paper brown or if the bad one turns your paper brown. But like he definitely has picked up a poisonous one that like turned the paper brown that otherwise he would have like sauteed and the family would have eaten. So I mean, Tony, I mean, just where's your regulatory heartburn on like legalizing this to the point where people think it's copacetic to go out and pick their own mushrooms in the woods?
I know enough about mushrooms to know that I shouldn't, and that generally untrained people shouldn't be trying to pick and choose. There's just a risk there. There's a risk factor that doesn't make sense. If psilocybin and magic mushrooms are ultimately legalized or decriminalized or otherwise made available in the stream of commerce, that's fine. And I hope that people that choose to use it go to their dispensary and pay for it instead of wandering around the forest of Portland, of Oregon and Washington State.
I read a really interesting quote in one, and I wish I could remember the author and the source so I could cite them. But they were talking to a Brazilian health official about magic mushrooms and about kind of, because they have a more lax regulatory structure and legal structure around psilocybin, like what the practical effects is. And his response was very like, whatever, because his point was it's not like these people are just constantly eating mushrooms. Part of that is because there's a pretty your body adapts in the short term pretty quickly, and so it's hard to like habitually chronically use magic mushrooms. It's more kind of like a one and done, and then you have to give your body time to get to like unadapt so that you can go back and actually get a stronger feeling. But the second thing is they're hard to find. They're out in the woods. You have to like it takes a fairly significant amount of effort to go out in the woods and find these things. And then if it's part of like a group of friends and you're sharing those, you're dividing those among your group. And I was just thinking that like, okay, so in a country without the rainforest, right? And really without like a great deal of we're just our urban development is completely different from how Brazil is, specifically kind of in the very, very tropical areas. And so for us, if the U.S. allowed for psilocybin, I don't see that same kind of, oh yeah, whatever, people aren't going to use it that much because they're just going to find it out in the woods. It would have to be through a kind of a corporate licensed structure. What do you think, Tony?
No, I agree. Well, let's balance out some of the risk that we talked about, because we've kind of said two things here. We've said that, generally mellow mushrooms are low in toxicity, and that, the effects are generally pretty mild. There is a chance for overdose, but, that takes quite a bit of quantity to achieve. And then we've also said that some people who go out looking for magic mushrooms die within 2 days. So let's talk a bit about the overdosing issue with magic mushrooms. How much of a threat are general safe, quote unquote, magic mushrooms to the populace?
From my research, they're not. They're not a threat. So they're at least if you define threat as you will eat X amount or consume X amount of psilocybin containing mushrooms, like this amount will kill you. It's actually the opposite. Is it just seems the toxicity level is relatively small. And because of that, interestingly, the studies I've read are on people who are generally at-risk medical patients. So probably the biggest, most important, most quoted study on this was something that came out of Johns Hopkins. It was a study that was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, and basically studied the effects of psilocybin on late-stage terminal cancer patients. And when just to clarify, if you're really steeped in this, and you're for some reason listening to our show about psilocybin, to clarify, they started with just purely terminal, and then they decided that, well, no, anyone can be super anxious and depressed if you have cancer, because it raises all of these existential questions about your life. And so they basically expanded it to anyone who was suffering from, clinical depression that was directly correlated with or directly caused by the fact that they were suffering from pretty severe cancer. And what the period, the study took place over 9 months, and you had this group of 51 cancer patients that were either exposed to a very low dose of psilocybin, so 1 or 3 milligrams, or a high dose of 22 or 30 milligrams. And it wasn't clear why that distinction was made. I think it may have been on like male or female, or on a small person or a large person. But just to be clear, there was no placebo, right? So you did get psilocybin one way or the other. It's just whether or not you got a very low dose or very high dose. And then you went into therapy, basically. You had these, you were actively talked to, you filled out these questionnaires, and they tried to get a baseline for where you were from a psychological perspective. And then they kind of measured you after you had these sessions with psilocybin. And they'd sit you in a chair. From my readings, they put a blindfold on you, and they kind of wanted you to just sit and kind of sink into your thoughts and really lean into some of the things that scared you. So one of the really compelling anecdotes that I saw from one of the primaries on the study was, he was actually talking to one of the patients and was saying, you have this fear of being dead and being buried and being in the ground. And like, I want you to lean into that fear and think about that fear when you have psilocybin. And the results were pretty incredible. And on the other side is that you had these people who were reporting that it was almost like this fog had been lifted. This weight was off of their chest, that these people going through something terrible, they really seem to have come to terms with what they were experiencing in a way that they hadn't been able to do prior to those sessions.
Yeah, I mean, looking at some of the research that's been done, a lot of it from overseas on magic mushrooms and psilocybin, I mean, it really puts the magic in the term magic mushrooms. I mean, it's really incredible. And I'm being serious. I mean, there's another study that shows that magic mushrooms can reduce depression in cancer patients, again, but also that it can treat cigarette addiction better than pharmaceutical products like Chantix. So, this is the type of product that potentially has a lot of different uses. And look, it makes sense when you think about it. If you look at the history of the world in economical senses, in the economical lens, there's a reason why this one magic mushroom has created this robust black market around itself. It's because it does something that people found valuable. So I guess at the end of the day, it's not much of a surprise that that's backed up in these trial studies.
Yeah, and you read the anecdotes, and you just really diving deep into this over the course of like a week. You have this emphasis on psilocybin or ayahuasca or even like a drug like LSD, where it's much less about daily use and more about this kind of singular experience. This thing kind of, you consume it, and it gives you this short-term alternative of perspective on your life, and then from that you can kind of transition in a way. So it's almost like, at a Tough Mudder, like where you're running up that ramp at the end that's like 15 feet high, and you can't quite get there yourself, and really the only way to get up there is if someone reaches down and grabs your arm and it kind of pulls you up. That's like that seems to be kind of what the comparison is with psilocybin or with these psychedelics, is that it kind of yanks you out of your daily experience and kind of your sense of self in a way that it would be very difficult without that kind of experience. So, I mean, have you seen that same type of just kind of description of the culture around these psychedelics, where it seems to be much more about the singular or the kind of cluster of experiences rather than daily use?
Yeah. I mean, to put it in the over-the-counter sort of parlance, say you have an inflamed ankle or joint, you can use Advil every day to treat the symptom, or you can go get a cortisone shot that will last for a period of time. And I think that's the way people view their hallucinogenic trips, is that, this is something that I want to do or that I need to do for therapeutical reasons. and I'm going to go do it on this weekend, with the proper protective measures in place in my house or in a safe place. And then that sort of experience is going to carry me for some time. Right.
Right. And this was something that you and I talked about a little bit offline, but do you think that the scheduling system, so kind of the way that we've scheduled drugs, hurts just kind of the practical ways that we think about the potential medical efficacy of some of these drugs?
Absolutely. Without the war on drugs, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now. We probably would have been having this type of conversation 5 or 10 years ago, if not longer. So yeah, absolutely. It's pretty clear from the research that's been done that there's some value in psilocybin. It's a different conversation regarding decriminalization and legalization. I understand it's a different policy discussion, but it's pretty clear that more research should have been done on this substance, and there should be a greater level of understanding amongst the populace. And, we were talking offline, but look, in the 90s, I was living in North Carolina going through the DARE program. And my impression from the officer from the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department was that if I took any of those drugs that he pointed out, that I was going to die, right? That was the impression I was left with in 1992 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. That's pretty clearly not the case when you look at some of the substances like psilocybin, like cannabis, and some of the other things that he had on the board. So yeah, I think it's time for us to have this discussion. And the good thing about having this discussion, and the good thing about sort of America as a concept, we have 50 states that can be laboratories for the country, is that some of the regulations that are turning over now can really inform more conservative states as to how to approach this in the years to come.
Were you ever asked to be one of those dare kids when you were younger? Like not like the counselor, but like there were like kids, like older kids that were kind of like the dare role models. At my school, so like I transferred to my big public high school when I was a sophomore, and I remember like the cool kids, like a lot of the cool kids got to be like the dare role models, even though like I know what you guys were doing like on your weekends, like you were not dare role models, at least for what kind of my understanding of dare was. And I was sitting at home, like didn't drink, didn't smoke, just kind of very kind of the nerdy high schooler.
This is the perfect opportunity for you to call your elementary school principal and say, hey, look, I ran the Office of Medical Marijuana Use. I made it.
Well, does DARE start in elementary school? Is that,
we
is
did
it like,
it in elementary.
did they start that young?
No. Well, when I did it, I was in, I think, 3rd grade.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Maybe it's you do it in elementary school, and so like you have the high schoolers kind of come in to be the DARE role models and like help out, but the high schoolers aren't really doing DARE.
Well, and to be clear, I have no idea if DARE still exists. I suspect that it doesn't.
I'll tell you from a simple Google search, DARE still has a web presence. They have uploaded a video as of March 25th, 2019, so not the most current, but they do seem to be functioning still. Okay, well, that was a tangent. Okay, so bringing it back, I can't help but thinking from a regulatory perspective that you have just specifically psilocybin, and you have a couple promising studies. The scheduling system of just saying that something has no medicinal value, high propensity for abuse, and you kind of throw it into this lockbox where no one can really touch it unless you go through extreme measures to get access to it and to get permission to be able to touch it. Seems like it really hurts just basic scientific understanding, which creates this problem, that we're going to talk about next, which is some of this stuff like cannabis and now seemingly like psilocybin. You have people who use that momentum and use that prohibition against you, kind of like judo. They're using the federal government's own just aggressiveness against it by saying that like this substance, whatever substance X is, doesn't kill people and we're now seeing that has a just demonstrable medical benefit, or at least a potential demonstrable medical benefit. The absolute prohibition does not make sense. And so you see the pendulum strongly swing the other direction like we've seen in Oakland and Denver. Tony, you want to talk a little bit about some of those ordinances that we're seeing pop up over on the West Coast?
Yeah, I mean, Denver is one of the breeding grounds for this, proving grounds. They've initiated Ordinance I-301, and the effect is basically that the local government can't use city funds or resources to prosecute the personal possession of psilocybin mushrooms for adults. And personal possession is defined pretty broadly. It protects quote-unquote personal possession, which includes possession, storage, and propagation. However, personal possession does not include sale for compensation, or as it states here, for remuneration, or displays or use in public. I want to get back to that remuneration line because I feel like that was pretty purposely placed there. It sounds like they've set up a structure in this gray area to allow kind of giving it away, quote unquote. It may be give it away and give me some sort of gift or there may be some sort of barter system put in place, it seems like. And I think the folks in Denver, I think there's enough hippies out there to operationalize that. But enough on that. Also, Oakland, California was one of the first cities I saw pushing on this issue. They have Resolution 87731 that's decriminalizing entheogenic plants. And essentially, it's kind of along the same lines. No city funds or resources to assist in the enforcement of laws imposing criminal penalties for the use and possession of entheogenic plants by adults. Let's talk about that term a little bit, Christian. Entheogenic. You want to define that for me?
Yeah. Okay. I just want to start. I don't really tweet that much. And I actually tweeted that the definition that the city of Oakland uses for entheogenic plants is like the most Oaklandy thing I've ever read in my entire life. So this is the definition. And I don't like to read to people, but like I'm going to read to you how the Oakland defines this umbrella term that includes, hallucinogens. Entheogenic plants, based on the term entheogen, originally conceived by Ott Ruck and other colleagues from a working group of anthropologists and ethnobotanists in 1979, and defined herein as the full spectrum of plants, fungi, and natural materials deserving reverence and respect from the perspective of the individual and the collective, that can inspire personal and spiritual well-being, can benefit psychological and physical wellness, and can reestablish humans' inalienable and direct relationship to nature. That is in an ordinance in the city of Oakland.
Wait. So if you disrespect the plant, it falls outside of the definition?
Absolutely. So if you disrespect, if you do not revere this mushroom, then it doesn't qualify as entheogenic, but it creates the imperative is like you shall revere this, Tony. You shall revere this. But notice that also, I mean, this definition is so problematic because you've got the can, so it can inspire personal and spiritual well-being, can benefit psychological and physical well-being, but it's also got this definition, so it's plants, fungi, and other natural materials. So like what is a natural material? I'm like, and how far down the processing rung can you get? Like heroin at one point was a natural material, like it's made from poppies, which is converted to opium. It comes from nature. Like most thing, an Oreo originally came from nature. You split it apart and then you put it back together. And so I know this that may be taking a little bit far, but this is.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, if I get caught in the city of Oakland with a bushel of Oreo plants, I want to make sure that I'm protected under this ordinance.
Okay, so entheogenic, I had to look this up because I had never seen I had never seen the word in context used in a statute or an ordinance for entheogenic. And so, but entheogenic requires a use. So you only become entheogenic if that substance is used in like a ritualistic, shamanistic, spiritual practice, right? And so what this reminded me of this definition, that Geico commercial where there's two old ladies sitting in a room, and one old lady is like, I decided to step into the 21st century, and I'm posting, instead of mailing all of my trip photos to my friends, I'm posting them on my wall. And it's just a woman with like a physical bedroom wall behind her, and she's just like duct taped all of her pictures to the wall. And then the other lady's like, this doesn't make any sense. And they have an argument then about like car insurance. But then the one lady with the wall is like, I unfriend you. And the lady stands up and is like, this is not how this works. This is not how any of this works. And like, this is not how drug policy like works. And I'm not saying that this isn't like necessarily a good or a bad thing, but federal drug policy and by extension, most states that have incorporated federal prohibition of scheduling into their drug laws is based on compounds and is based on substance. And so when you go to the DEA website, you have 17 pages of alphabetized compounds that are explicitly scheduled, right? Because every week it seems like there's a new compound that's hitting the market, and you can't have a constant just like overarching name for these things. You have to define the compounds in order for actual criminal prosecutions to be effective, and actual for scientists to know what they're testing for. And so so when you throw under this legal umbrella that like if you're entheogenic, which by definition means it needs to have some underpinning use of spiritualistic or shamanistic or ritualistic practice that's kind of part of this spiritual event, it makes enforcement and compliance extremely cumbersome and complicated.
Yeah, and I have to imagine that was by design, at least partially.
I agree. And so what the way I read this ordinance is that it basically means that law enforcement, if they are attempting to prosecute for anything other than like a large scale distribution or like trafficking of psilocybin, mescaline, peyote, ayahuasca, LSD, they're going to have a real hard time doing that because they basically are prohibited from using city dollars on them. So, Tony, you're sitting in a statewide regulated perspective. So it's either the health department, their California's equivalent of health or DBPR, or a state's attorney, and you're seeing this ordinance come down. What are you thinking from the perspective of local governments kind of creating this ambiguous umbrella term for psychedelics and hallucinogens, basically saying it's all bets are off within that local government?
Yeah, if you're sitting in a regulatory or enforcement role in California and you have a primary responsibility for bringing or investigating cases involving psychedelics or other prohibited substances, this definitely makes your job more comfortable, more complicated. But the fortunate thing is that it's only involving one municipality in the entire state, so you have that. And going back to my earlier comments, as an observer, I love it because we're going to be able to get some data out of Oakland with respect to driving under the influence of mushrooms, with respect to how much market activity there's been. That won't be direct data. That might be some observations and some research. But we're going to get a chance to see what does this mean for the crime rate? What does this mean for education outcomes? What does this mean for teen usage? We're going to learn all that, I think, in Denver and Oregon, in Denver and in Oakland. So, I think that's the positive here. This to the extent that this language is too loose, they're going to learn it pretty quickly, and hopefully they'll be able to fix it.
I think that's true. I think that we are where we are with drug policy in the United States, and we are obviously here because of cannabis, because of what happened in the late 90s through the 2000s. And where we are today with more than half the country with medical marijuana statutes and frameworks, and over 10 recreational states, despite federal prohibition, is local governments and in the case of Oregon now, some states feel emboldened to make drug policy that directly counters federal enforcement. And what I want to watch very closely, because this is a test case, whether or not the federal government just says absolutely not, we're not going down this road, because we start getting into a slippery slope when local governments or even states are creating policies that run directly counter to a federal prohibition. And so in this case, maybe decriminalization, okay, that gets it through. But in Oregon's case, right, there is a referendum that very well could be on the 2020 ballot. It likely will be on the 2020 ballot. And it's only polling at 47 to 48% approval right now, so we're not going to dive too deeply into it. But it creates an actual regulated structure for psilocybin. I see something like that as a really big test case for whether or not a U.S. attorney steps in and says, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going down this road. Because if the federal government lets that happen, you're going to get into a situation where you have drug policy all over the country that just kind of shatters into this kind of mosaic of different forms of policy. And from my perspective, when I'm looking at this as a regulator, these structures, when you remove that consistency, you really hurt your enforceability of the laws you have in the books, because normal people living their days don't have time, don't have the inclination to study this constellation of regulatory frameworks. They need some consistency for how we're going to prohibit or allow drugs in the United States.
Well, and that's the fascinating thing, because you asked me before about my heartburn as a regulator reacting to some of these new initiatives. Let's talk a bit about heartburn as a regulatory attorney, right? I would not feel comfortable sending a client into this industry under a local ordinance with Bill Barr serving as Attorney General at Department of Justice, right? So there's some real federal issues to deal with here, and that situation is going to be pretty precarious. Now, of course, under most of these initiatives, not the Oregon one, obviously, but the Denver and Oakland, it's supposed to create a non-commercial industry. But we're going to see some evolution on that, especially if this Oregon ballot initiative gets approved. I mean, 47% is close enough to be viable, right? Especially, I presume that no money's been spent on it. No messaging has been done on it yet. It's just purely paperwork at this point. So, I mean, to me, that has a chance of passing. So I think we're going to see a lot of heartburn, especially as it relates to federal prosecutors. And whether there's a memo issued by somebody at DOJ relating to psilocybin and how their treatment's going to be and what that memo says. I think there will be. And I think that what's contained in that memo is going to be bad for the industry, potentially.
Right. I mean, from the federal government has a problem here, because by their position on cannabis, by holding firm to absolute Schedule I prohibition of cannabis, despite 20 years of statutory and regulatory evolution at the state level, has created this situation where people at the local and state level are genuinely asking themselves, is it better to ask for forgiveness than permission? And are looking at these things, for example, raising money in order to invest in psychedelics and potentially, positioning yourself to take advantage of a system like it, if it's not Oregon, it will be a state that allows this, because it seems like there is some momentum, unless some kind of exogenous variable happens that we're not predicting right now, or the federal government steps in. And so at some point, the federal government is either going to have to say the law is the law, and if you're not going to enforce it, there will be a consequence, or they're going to continue down this kind of malaise where they're not consistently enforcing federal drug laws, and it's just going to get more convoluted and confusing down the road. Can I tell you a lighthearted, confusing thing that I've seen that I think is just so interesting to read about from the entheogenic medicines and treatments that I've researched on the internet? Have you ever heard of the Colorado river toad?
No. Well, I think I have, but tell me.
Okay, so the Colorado river toad is arguably a source of entheogenic treatment where it produces toxins. And if you Google Colorado river toad, you will legit see mugshots and stories of people who are arrested because they pick up these river toads and they are literally like licking them. And my understanding was that the licking thing is kind of not really how you're supposed to get toad venom into your body, that like you can smoke it. So like I read this is really going down a rabbit hole, but Mike Tyson, if you Google Mike Tyson and toad venom, there's a legitimate meme, like legitimate string of stories, because Mike Tyson has this quote where he said he basically credits smoking toad venom as saying that's basically why he's a normal person now. And the quote was, "Once I smoked it, everything went boom. When I came down, my brain was functioning and I could talk, but I was saying, quote, I effed up." So basically, like, toad venom pulled him out of crazy Mike Tyson mode and kind of made him the calmer, normal man he is today, right? But like toad venom it falls within this entheogenic classification of this kind of ritualistic, spiritual treatment, and like you can go way down a rabbit hole with toad venom.
The whole time you've been talking, I've been looking at this Mike Tyson situation online. There is an article in GQ from last month by Alex Papademos, formerly of Grantland, great writer, called "Mike Tyson Smokes a Toad." It's actually in the culture section, and it also has to do with his cannabis ventures that he has as well. It's pretty interesting. So, but I will read that after we get done with this podcast.
Basically it's a bunch of stories off of the same quote. It's basically I didn't find a whole lot of like depth to the reporting. It's just basically Mike Tyson saying, but I mean, remember, this guy had a pet tiger, like he had a tattoo on half of his face. Like, he's not the most credible person for studying the efficacy of medicine, but like you do have an international celebrity talking about toad venom, smoking toad venom and having positive mental effects. But like, okay, so it goes deeper when you go on the internet and the deep web about toad venom, right? So I found these things called Kambo ceremonies, Kambo. So I may be mispronouncing that, but so Kambo is the secretion of a giant Amazonian tree frog, right? And so like they live in the Amazon river valleys, and they're kind of up in trees. And so from what I was reading, it seemed like some of the times, in order to kind of help you absorb the toxins from the frog, like you burn yourself or somebody burns you and you put it on the burn. So apparently you absorb it. But I don't know. I'm not a Kambo expert. I'm just reading what the internet is telling me about this. But so the reason I found out about Kambo is because I found these stories about this woman who died from it, right? And apparently she like put it up right against her chest and she went into cardiac arrest from the Kambo poison. So there is literally an international association of Kambo practitioners, and the best part though is that so they literally have on their website in 2 consecutive sentences, right? So, bullet points. So bullet point 1 is Kambo is 100% safe. Literally the next sentence: it's true that there have been accidents in the past and that people have died, but the number is very small, and circumstances of these deaths have shown that Kambo should not have been given to them because of pre-existing health conditions. So like, if you are readily admitting to deaths on your website, you cannot say that treatment is 100% safe, right? You see this, like every time I research like Kambo or frog poison, toad poison, whatever, it's all like, oh yeah, this is perfectly safe. And then you read about articles where people are literally dying from it. All right, so do you have any additional kind of thoughts that we didn't touch on?
No, but there's one thing that you mentioned before. That's not how it works.
That's not how any of this works.
I think really going to be informative for people that are looking to get into this space or looking to determine whether they should get into the space, which is the parallels between cannabis regulation and legalization. What's your thoughts on that?
There's some very interesting parallels to cannabis, and for people who are kind of watching this, it seems to be following a similar trajectory, right? So you start with terminal and severely affected patients, understanding that the cannabis operated underground for a long time. The momentum from a regulatory perspective, from a legal perspective, was really this thing helps sick people. And then from there, okay, we have anchored that there is at least some medical value to very sick people. Okay, so then obviously if it's appropriate for sick people, we should control how it's produced and how it's distributed to them. So there needs to be some de minimis framework operating within this regulatory structure in order to at least provide for the safety of these sick and afflicted people. And then you now have a structure there, an ecosystem. And as that ecosystem exists, it starts to, it's now the inertia is broken and it starts to grow. And it's easier for state legislatures to expand qualifying conditions or lower barriers to entry for people who want to produce this controlled substance. And once you have this ecosystem, then the drumbeat starts about, we have this ecosystem, we have these studies, it's clearly not hurting anybody. This should allow for a wider use, so a wider medical use, and then potentially a adult use. And then, so once you have that, well, you reach a certain tipping point of that ecosystem where the industry becomes self-sustaining. It hires lobbyists, it hires lawyers, and you have an entrenched industry at that point, which will continue to grow. So where we're at right now with psilocybin is you have some evidence showing that this could help sick people, right? And so I think there's a legitimate opportunity here for people to begin positioning themselves as that safe provider for this substance for genuinely sick people. And if it follows the same trajectory as cannabis, then that ecosystem will start to develop around those very limited licenses and limited structure. So let me talk to you a little bit about so assuming that there is a structure, or that in the next few years a structure emerges in some of these states to safely provide psilocybin to patients, like where do you think the market opportunities are for these people who are looking to move money or looking to kind of have an eye towards potentially getting involved in like a psychedelic industry?
Well, it feels too early to say, but there's, probably close to 100 million, if not more than $100 million in venture capital that says otherwise, right? So to me, it seems too early to jump in. But in terms of plotting the path, I mean, your comments about cannabis legalization and sort of looking at the states that they continue to lurch towards decriminalization and legalization and regulation, I think you could potentially see a similar path for psychedelics. However, I think the resistance to it is going to remain stickier. I mean, I just don't think you ever see, not in the next 20, 25 years, you ever see states like Alabama and Mississippi get there, even on a limited program without some significant rescheduling and activity on the federal level, FDA, et cetera. I just don't think you get conservative southern states and some conservative western and midwestern states to bite on this. So the market may be smaller, but we're going to see in states like Oregon, California, Colorado, and some others, we're going to see what it looks like pretty quickly.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, just kind of thinking this through, what is interesting to me though is the reality that we now live in, which is that if you have the political capital and the organizational skills and some money, you can get referendums on ballots in some of these more liberal states, right? The states that are more likely than the Southeast or the Midwest to legalize or decriminalize drugs, right? It only really takes one of these states to create a basic medical psilocybin structure for this thing to really entrench and start to take off. I'm very interested to see where that goes, because I think the only thing that kills that is if that and this kind of momentum is the federal government steps in and says we are not going further down this road. Cannabis was it, but from here on out, Schedule 1 means Schedule 1, and we're going to prosecute people who are violating the law.
Yeah, but I go back to a concept we talked about in a previous podcast about my father, right? My dad's a 70-year-old retired colonel from the United States Air Force, right? And he plays racquetball every day with a bunch of guys who are retired master sergeants and tech sergeants and lieutenant colonels and generals and all these guys from different military branches that meet at this gym and play racquetball. And to convince them about cannabis is one thing. Some of those guys are convincible, some of them won't be, but you'll get to some of them. in having that conversation. To convince that group of guys, 70-year-old, voting members of society, about magic mushrooms, LSD, psilocybin, Colorado river toads, any of these concepts we've talked about today, I think that's going to be much more difficult. So what we really may need for this to take hold in something that looks like a 50 state, a 15 state, a 25 state, a 40 state sort of solution, we may need a generational turnover. This may be a project that's 30 or 40 years in the future. Because frankly, there's some guys I went to law school with and some ladies I went to law school with that we probably couldn't convince on magic mushrooms, but you could convince on cannabis. I think this one's probably going to need more time. But with all that said, and we've talked about this concept before, there's value in being a first mover, and getting money in early means that you have a chance to watch that money grow. So, shout out to all the people out there that are being aggressive and looking at ways to legally test this market in jurisdictions where they can, including, like I said, all that VC activity is happening in Europe and Canada right now.
Right. And I think you're right. And because I think that there's some degree of reticence, not some degree, that there will be overt reticence to psilocybin in a way that wasn't necessarily there for cannabis, I'm really interested in the pharmaceutical side of this, so that the people who are, when you read these stories about people who are raising money and looking to invest in psychedelics, they're looking at like the biotech, the pure biotech side. So actually creating a something that could actually be prescribed in the federal medical FDA approved prescribed definition. Because I think the future of psilocybin, if it moves in the next decade, is to reschedule and then allow a limited use of skilled practitioners to be able to A, scientifically study this, and then B, down the road, if it passes muster with those trials, to be able to give to patients in like a clinical setting, which is how most drugs, like basically every other drug but cannabis, works in this country right now. As Tony mentioned, I think this is something that we're going to follow pretty closely because it's interesting to both of us, not only from a regulatory perspective, which is most of what we talked about, but that Tony and I both really love that overlap between business and regulatory law. And there does seem to be something there.
Absolutely, especially with this being on the ballot in 2020. There's going to be a lot to talk about.
Right. So Tony and I, as I mentioned at the start, we're back to a more consistent recording schedule, and so look for more regulated pods in the future. This is something that I definitely enjoy doing. It's one of the highlights of my week when we get to do it. And there's so much stuff that's been going on from a regulatory perspective that I'm really excited to Tony get you back on the mic and to really dig into. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and sign off, and we'll be talking to you soon.
All right, man. Talk to you soon. Have a good one.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.